economy, it was 6.8%. Consumer prices were low. It was a period with low inflation. And if you see the gross official reserves, there was a massive accumulation of gross official reserves, which went up from $1,018 billion to $3,606 billion by 2014. And in fact, the GDP of China almost increased by 5 times. Let me take you down each of the policies that Zhao Ziachuan pursued as the governor of the People's Bank of China. The first one is the RMB exchange rate policy, and Zhao Ziachuan realized that a more flexible exchange rate policy was necessary in case China was to integrate with the world economy. So he started to introduce a market-based unified managed floating system of exchange rates, and then further went on to make RMB convertible for current account transactions. It was around the same period that India adopted the rupee became convertible on current account transactions. Thereafter, further reforms of the RMB, China moved to a managed floating rate exchange system, and where the currency moved in both directions. I do remember being in the IMF when the RMB increased by about 3.1% against the dollar, and it was a day of great celebration from the United States chair, which said that China has finally acceded to join the world economy. And then further down, as the global financial crisis came, they went back to a fixed exchange rate, and by 2010, the RMB returned to a managed float exchange rate regime. The second big change that Zhao Ziachuan pursued was banking sector reforms. And the Chinese authorities placed banking sector reform at the center of their overall policy agenda. And recapitalization and restructuring of the Bank of China, if you see the size of Chinese banks, you can compare it with the American banks, and you'll see each of the Chinese banks are much larger in size, be it the ICBC compared to Bank of America, be it the CCB compared to Wells Fargo, or JP Morgan compared to the Agriculture Bank of China, or the Bank of China itself. And each of them are much, much larger in size as compared to even the American banks. So, and each bank was in need of massive recapitalization and restructuring. China injected about $45 billion into recapitalization of the Bank of China and the China Construction Bank. The monies were transferred from international reserves to the Central Huijun Investment Company to finance the recapitalization. A central bank regulatory commission was established. Performance assessment indicators, external oversight, and strengthening corporate governance of banks was pursued. In the period 2003 to 10, China strengthened the bank's balance sheets, internal control systems, governance, and credit risk management in state banks. Chinese government provided financial support to restore capital adequacy and full provisioning of the non-performing loans. Shortly thereafter, the operating profits of the Bank of China and China Construction Bank improved. China allowed foreign ownership of banks, with the Bank of America and HSBC procuring stakes in the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and the Bank of Communications. They also took steps to monitor large exposures and introduced a deposit insurance scheme. The activities of the Agriculture Bank of China and the regional credit cooperatives received a lot of attention. Given the huge scale of operations and exposure to the agriculture sector, restructuring of both these banks was pursued. By 2006, China was witnessing GDP growth of 10.5%, fixed investment was 30%, and trade surplus had surged to $135 billion. Foreign exchange reserves had reached $895 billion. It was expected that GDP growth would easily exceed 10%, and rural incomes would continue to rise, consumer credit facilities expand. Inflation was less than 2%, and China was undertaking a huge range of reforms like adoption of VAT, high social sector allocations for health and education, pensions, while accelerating the development of capital markets. The third major area that was pursued in Zhao Ziachuan's tenure was financial sector reforms, wherein which they pursued exchange rate flexibility, wherein they conducted the Financial System Stability Assessment, and this was undertaken in consultation with the IMF, and the FSAP underscored the importance of careful sequencing of financial sector reforms. The five major areas that were covered were exchange rate flexibility, monetary policy framework, improvements in regulation and supervision, financial market development, interest rate liberalization, and capital account liberalization. Even as they were pursuing major financial sector reforms, the global financial crisis of 2008 to 10 erupted, which changed the world's perception of the Chinese economic miracle. How did China respond to the global financial crisis? China felt that the question of international currency that will secure global financial stability and facilitate world economic growth needed to be immediately addressed. Zhao Ziaochuan pleaded for reform of the international monetary system that yielded win-win results for all stakeholders. He said special consideration should be given to giving the SDR a greater role. The SDR has features and potential to act as a super sovereign reserve currency. Moreover, an increase in SDR allocation would help the fund address its resources problems and difficulties in voice and representation reform. The scope of using the SDR should be broadened so as to enable it to fully satisfy member countries' demand for a reserve currency. China continued to persist with this call for the mandate of the IMF to be expanded and quota and voice reforms. Zhao Ziaochuan's successor, Dr. Yi Gang, said that the current financial crisis, which originated in developed countries, had resulted in substantial losses for countries of the world. The failure of the major international financial institutions to issue timely warnings highlights the consequences of misfocused surveillance. Only through the acceleration of fundamental reforms of the major financial institutions would be able to discharge the mandate assigned to it by the member countries. It is critical that the fund completes in a timely manner the reform objective announced by the G20 leaders, namely a shift of at least 5 percentage points of quota shares in favor of emerging markets and developing member countries. In 2009, the world heard China in a time of crisis, as it represented the only country with a significant current account surplus and trade surplus and a double-digit growth. China's response to the global financial crisis was quick, determined, and effective. It comprised of 3 strands: a major fiscal stimulus, extraordinary credit expansion, repegging the RMB to the dollar, and the IMF recommended that there was also an increase in spending and capital projects by about 31%. Growth picked up in the second quarter of 2009 and reached 9.1%. Reserve accumulation was rapid. They were almost accumulating $40 billion per month. The balance of payments saw dramatic changes with a fall of export volumes and foreign direct investment. However, there was an export rebound by July 2009, and by July 2010, the People's Bank of China announced a return to the managed float exchange rate system. The pace at which China was growing necessitated the world to take note of the spillovers of the Chinese economy. So the IMF formulated a spillover report as mandated by the G20, which highlighted the significance of China's influence on the world economy. The report said that as the world's most central trader, China's capacity to transmit and originate real shocks was rising. Clearly, China held an important stake in the world in its stability. Its export-oriented growth model was seen as a source of stresses, and economic rebalancing was essential. Currency appreciation was important to the process of rebalancing. A failure to rebalance the growth model would imply unprecedented increases in its export share. China launched a number of policies to address this phenomenon. The policies that were launched are the One Belt, One Road, Going Global, RMB internationalization, and Made in China 2025. Going global urges Chinese firms to take advantage of the booming world trade to invest in global markets. Going global seeks to move Chinese economy to an innovation-driven economy and has two high-profile initiatives. The first is the Belt and Road Initiative and second is capacity innovation. The Belt and Road Initiative, or the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road is a China-centered regional connectivity network which is financed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank up to 160 billion yuan. Slowed down in the medium term, addressing global imbalances was of primary importance. However, the IMF said that given its size, openness, high investment rate, high import content of its investment and exports, a slowdown in China is likely to have strong global spillovers. The negative spillovers will weigh on the global growth, but the effects will vary with the country's level and type of exposure to China. Let me go to the issue of renminbi internationalization. From 2011, China has pursued a gradual increase in the international use of the renminbi. Currently, it has about 28 renminbi currency swap agreements, RMB offshore markets. There are also clearing banks in 14 countries, the largest of which operates in the Hong Kong Special Administered Region. The Bank of China acts as the clearing bank and a payments infrastructure has been created. Sales of renminbi financial products have also been conducted in London as part of the plans to expand the offshore RMB business and other financial centers. At the third plenum of the 18th Communist Party Congress Central Committee in 2013, it was announced that China would speed up the process towards capital account convertibility. China introduced partial or full convertibility in 35 out of 40 items of the IMF's classification of capital accounts. If you see India's restrictions on capital account convertibility and compare it with China, we found in the initial years around 2006, Chinese had nearly double the number of restrictions that we had on terms of capital account convertibility. However, over a period of time, like the Darpg committee recommended the progress to full capital account convertibility, China adopted a gradual pace, and it took them almost a decade and a half to reach this level where they brought 35 out of 40 items, relaxations were provided. Zhao Ziyachuan always felt that China adopted the concept of managed convertibility while retaining capital account management on 4 items which are widely adopted in most countries. The RMB was officially included in the SDR currency basket on October 1, 2016. The Chinese authorities felt that it was a significant milestone in the process of RMB internationalization and an acknowledgement of the progress in China's economic development, reform, and opening up. They also felt that it was a step that would help increase the representativeness, stability, and attractiveness of the SDR and improve the international monetary system. China published its foreign exchange reserves, the balance of international payments, and international investment positions in US dollar and SDR terms. China also started issuing RMB-based bonds, the panda bonds, to the Japanese corporations. However, Japan has remained reluctant to join RMB internationalization. Despite China's best efforts, the dollar will remain the preeminent global reserve currency. The structure of the political and legal institutions and the limited financial market make the development of RMB very difficult as a major reserve asset. Despite China's best efforts, the RMB's use in international transactions fell by about 30%. The quota and governance reforms of the IMF were approved by the United States Congress on December 18, 2015, on the eve of the Hangzhou G20 summit. And the United States Congress approved a significant shift of quota shares of about 5% from developed countries to developing economies. And the managing director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, said that the United States Congress approval of these reforms is a welcome and crucial step forward that will strengthen the IMF in its role of supporting global financial stability. The reforms significantly increase the IMF's core resources, enabling us to respond to the crisis more effectively. Following the quota reforms, the IMF's quota resources increased to 477 billion from 238 billion. 6% of the quota shares shifted to a dynamic emerging market and developing countries. China became the third largest member after the United States and Japan. However, the Chinese authorities continue to say that the 2010 quota and governance reform has not significantly closed the gaps between the calculated quota shares and the actual weight in the global economy. They have been pressing for early completion of the 15th General Review of Quotas. After the quota reform, China's influence at the IMF, as also several international institutions, enhanced significantly. Today, China wields considerable policy influence post-IMF reforms 2015. Initially, we used to have 3 deputy managing directors at the IMF. Today, China has a seat on the high table. Zhu Min was appointed as special advisor to the managing director on May 3rd, 2010, and he was succeeded by Mr. Tao Zhang as the 4th deputy managing director on the IMF. Tao Zhang represents the elite Chinese bureaucracy, well versed with the fund's program design, review, and execution. As Deputy Managing Director, he has the stature and the institutional support and the credibility to influence key IMF decisions. As acting chair and Deputy Managing Director, he has been highly supportive of low-income countries. He has been supporting debt restructuring of several African countries like Chad, Mozambique, Republic of Congo, Ghana, Mauritania, and countries with elevated debt stresses, and has been urging them to undertake fiscal adjustment programs to deliver stronger economic performance. He has also been pushing for early releases towards many African countries. How has China's presence on international institutions increased? Today we can say that China's influence on international institutions is at an all-time high. It has strategically positioned itself to set up new international institutions where it wields considerable influence. It has a voting share of 6.09% on the IMF. A voting share on the ADB is 5.5%, which is making it the 3rd largest member in both institutions. It's also a member of the African Development Bank, the Caribbean Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It has tried to create alternate institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was established in 2014. And the kind of membership growth that the AIIB has witnessed is quite phenomenal. Today, 87 countries are members of the AIIB, and the AIIB is financing projects well outside Asia, including in Egypt, several projects in Africa, Russia. The AIIB has just concluded its annual meetings in 2018 at Mumbai with the theme Mobilizing Finance for Infrastructure Innovation and Collaboration. And it's financing 329 million for improvement of rural roads in Gujarat. And there's one more project that is being taken up by AIIB in India with an investment of 150 million for India's infrastructure sector. There are projects being taken up under the Belt and Road Initiative, the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Program, the Central Asia Regional Economic and Cooperation Program, and the Africa-Asia Growth Corridor. Further, China has also established the BRICS New Development Bank in July 2015 in association with the BRICS Bank members to establish a contingent reserve arrangement to address the short-term balance of payments crisis. One of the big success stories in terms of multilateral summits was the hosting of the 2016 Hangzhou Summit of the G20 leaders. The Hangzhou Consensus of the leaders of G20 is based on a vision to strengthen the G20's growth agenda, forging synergy in fiscal, monetary, structural policies promoting global trade through greater openness and inclusive growth. So they had a number of G20 plans. There is an Innovation Action Plan, there is a G20 Industrial Revolution Action Plan, a Digital Economy Development Cooperation Initiative, Enhanced Structural Reforms Agenda, the G20 Labour Ministers and Agriculture Ministers Action Plan. And in spite of the uncertainty brought by Brexit and the tariffs recently introduced, the G20 in the Hangzhou summit was quite a successful cooperation. So let me turn to the recent developments, and as I had said in the introduction, 2018 marks the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up policy. In October, the Communist Party National Congress declared China's entry into a new era and laid out a strategic vision for a great modern socialist country by mid-century. President Xi Jinping has said that what we now face is the contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. As China seeks to transform the economy from a high-speed to high-quality growth, it faces the challenge of fostering new growth engines, promoting innovation, industrial upgrading, and further opening up. It will have an important role in upholding the international trading system and will remain a major international creditor through the Belt and Road Initiative. In response to the trade tensions with the United States, China seeks to intensify its policy easing and stimulus measures. These include lowering the entry barriers on financial services, reducing import tariffs for a wide range of consumer goods, and loosening the sectoral restrictions on foreign investment. Further, as part of the accelerated rebalancing efforts, China seeks to deepen the fiscal structural reforms, including higher spending on health, and also introduce personal income tax reforms and further boost consumption and reduce income inequality. To conclude, let me say that China's unprecedented financial clout is visible in the international monetary system. The journey traversed is remarkable. The RMB's inclusion in the SDR basket of currencies is representative of China's rise in the international monetary system. From merely supporting the IMF's various policy measures, Chinese policies have become far more strident on the IMF's quota and following the IMF's quota and governance reform. China has called on the IMF to continue its quota and governance reforms to ensure that the IMF is more well represented. It has also called for strengthening of the surveillance capacity and research, and has given several suggestions on key common challenges being faced by member countries to provide early warning signals. It has been pressing ahead for further international monetary system reforms to address the deficiencies of the international monetary system. However, it continues to have a huge domestic policy agenda which China needs to address, and the implications or the decisions will have a lot of impact on the global economy. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
National monetary system that no country, including the United States, can afford to ignore. You referred, I'm going to open up the floor to questions, but I just want to insert a question of mine which you don't have to answer immediately. You can deal with it as you go along. I would prefer that you first answer questions from the floor. You dealt in passing with the trade tensions today with the United States, but that is the elephant in the room, in the sense that many people, observers of China, find it very extraordinary that China, which has over the years displayed such a deft ability to handle the international monetary system and to conduct themselves in such a way that they were always above this kind of action that the United States has taken, how did they suddenly fall victim to this kind of tariff action by the US? Was it because they did not have a satisfactory intellectual property protection regime? What was the reason why they tripped and fell, as it were, for a country which has, as I said, evoked worldwide admiration for the smoothness with which they have managed their climb without faltering, without stumbling and falling. This is the first stumble that is visible. And secondly, something that is much of the world worries about is China's imperial ambitions. China has loaned so much to the developing world, including Africa, and has over the years, in the recent years, said to African countries heavily indebted to China that debt could be converted into equity, so that and purchase of land in Africa by China, which suggests a form of creeping imperialism, a new imperialism, whereby China will actually be owning large tracts of land in countries in Africa, and owning natural resources in that very rich and untapped continent. So I will just leave those two issues for you to handle as and when you see fit. But please, yes, please.
Just a quick question on the
Kindly introduce yourself,
Oh
please.
yes, Sarang Shidore, University of Texas. Quick question on the pathway adopted by China, which is quite different from what's been advised to India and many other countries, which is that capital convertibility and liberalization, the traditional thinking is that it is a means to development. It is a way to propel growth and get to the next stage. In the Chinese case, it's the reverse. That liberalization has been as a product or as a next step after they have achieved certain stages of development. So should that not give us pause in India, because we have clearly not achieved what we were hoping for?
Can I take one more question and then respond?
Yeah.
Yes. Anybody else, or should I respond? Yes. Kalyani ji has.
Kalyan.
I have a follow-up question. What is that India is lacking in adopting some of these models borrowed from China? Is there something which we can do, or why we are not doing?
Would you like to answer these two, and then
Yes,
we can?
yes, ma'am. There are three questions, in fact. The first is the trade tensions with United States and the deft maneuverability. I do recall several meetings where the central bank governors would sit, and Alan Greenspan on one side and Zhao Ziaochuan on the other side, and the only issue that was discussed was how do we address global imbalances. And China's trade surpluses and its export-oriented growth model was so strong that it was not easy to address the trade imbalances. And the kind of trade surplus today China has with the United States ranges to about $375 billion. And the only way in which this imbalance could have been addressed was if Chinese exports slowed down. And China has slowed down exports. It wasn't that they did not try. They slowed down export. The other effort that was made was that the renminbi appreciated vis-a-vis the dollar, and which it did over a period of time across a limited band initially, and then they enhanced the band as a floating exchange rate system. Today, China's exports have come down from 22.3% of its GDP to something like 14.2%. So they have slowed down their export. In spite of it, their trade imbalance vis-a-vis the United States is very high. And the only way it could have been, in case America First policy is to be adopted, it was jobs in US could only be protected if tariffs were imposed. And they have imposed tariffs on $200 billion of goods initially. 24% tariffs have come in. China has retaliated with a fairly significant amount of tariffs. But where is it heading? How far is it going to be WTO compatible in the long run? That remains to be seen. And international research currently shows that the impact of tariffs at this point of time remains quite limited. And this we saw even in India's case, wherein which we were hit with sanctions in 1998. However, the impact on our export performance remained quite limited. So tariffs in itself are not going to hurt China's export strategy. They'll have to deliberately slow down. They'll have to divert the surpluses they're generating from their companies into capital-intensive projects. And that is something that I think they're going to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, where so many billions of dollars are being financed through the AIIB or through the BRI initiative itself into many countries. And Pakistan, for example, $62 billion projects are going to be taken up as part of the CPEC corridor, which is a huge amount of investment. Imperial ambitions, yes. I do recall China voted almost as much as India voted. We voted 2.32% on the IMF board in all my years from 2003 to 2007 on the IMF, and China voted 2.38%, 0.06% more than us. And they were a very subdued voice. They would hardly speak on any of the board discussions. And today they vote 6.09%, while we vote about 3%, 3.2% on the IMF board. In terms of quota shares, they have grown significantly. And with this huge current account surplus, they're also, in terms of their assets, there has been a massive increase in their overseas assets, and they have been making investments overseas at a very rapid rate, Today you go to Africa, almost in every country, including Addis Ababa, you'll find this massive building of the African Union headquarters that Chinese have built. You go to Chad, even in remote, in the heartland of Sahara, you'll find huge investments that they have made, and they have shown massive imperial ambitions. And if you look at some of the projects that are being posed by the neighboring countries to AIIB, you will find that several of our neighboring countries are posing more projects to the AIIB than to the ADB, because the project financing norms and also the cost of implementation of the projects is much simpler with regard to the transactional costs of AIIB are much simpler and lower as compared to the ADB. So it has not only us worried, it also has the Japanese very worried. Japanese very, very worried as to how China is financing so much money into Southeast Asia, and also into northern and sub-Saharan Africa. On the issue of capital account convertibility, when rupee became convertible on the current account, it was almost the same time when the RMB became convertible on the current account. And they had a huge number of capital account restrictions. You actually invested in China, you could not take money out of China. It was almost impossible to get money out of China. However, they created these special economic zones, Dalian, Shanxi, then Guangzhou further down, Hong Kong, of course, Macau. Huge amounts of Japanese investments have come in, and I had the opportunity to visit some of their apparel factories at Dalian, and I was amazed by the kind of size of the factories. Today you go into an apparel factory, say in Gurgaon or Noida, you'll find at best 500 workers working under a roof. You go to a Chinese apparel factory and you'll find 10,000 workers working under a roof. In terms of sheer scale of operations, I have not seen that size of scale. The only one that I saw comparable was the Brandix apparel factory at Visakhapatnam, where Dr. J.V. Rao was there with me when we went to Brandix in Chandrababu Naidu Garu's tenure, and that had about 5,000 to 7,000 workers working under one roof. But the path they have adopted for capital account convertibility was much slower than the path that India has adopted. And they were far more cautious with RMB internationalization. They introduced it only in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and they were very worried as to how Japan would respond to this, until Japanese corporations which were operating in many of their special economic zones did not adopt or issue these panda bonds or the dim sum bonds. They did not get into large-scale capital account convertibility, and they were far more conservative. And if you compare Dr. Duvur Subbarao's statements on capital account convertibility vis-a-vis Zhao Ziaochuan's statements, you'll find Zhao Ziaochuan was far more reluctant for capital account convertibility. What is it that we can adopt? We are a different model. Our growth model is comparatively very different, and in terms of industrial zones that they have created, in terms of the federal structure in which our land policies are implemented, I think the growth trajectory that India will follow would be quite different from China. And I cannot see the Reserve Bank of India with its managed floating exchange rate regime ever necessitating something like $3,880 billion of reserves which the People's Bank of China accumulated. We have about $400 billion today. $372 billion is the maximum we have accumulated. In fact, I do remember the day when Dr. Jalan came to meet the finance minister and said that today we have reached $100 billion of reserves. And it was such a celebratory movement when he came and said we have reached $100 billion of reserves, because a decade back, India was on the verge of a major economic crisis, and our foreign exchange reserves had come down to just 3 weeks of imports. So from there to reach $100 billion was a significant jump. And today we are at another 15 years later, we've accumulated another 272 more. But in that same period, China, with a fixed exchange rate or a very limited managed floating exchange rate, required this kind of financial cover. In case they have a crisis, perhaps they will need $2,000 billion rather than us, because the debt they are carrying, Chinese debt, is about $2,521 billion, which is almost 5 times the debt we are carrying. So they need that kind of reserves to protect their financial crisis.
That is internal debt, though.
Internal debt, yes. That is internal debt, yes. Yes. He has a question.
Yes,
Kindly
please.
introduce yourself, sir.
My name is Subhash Verma. My question is about 2 things. One is about democracy. Investing in Africa without asking any questions to the takers, and the money is available for the asking. Does that worry the whole world? We would like to know.
Any other questions? One other question we'll take.
I teach at Delhi University. I teach undergraduates. I want to ask,
What do you teach?
I teach economics and
Economics.
I want to know the historical comparison of China and US. US replaced UK. So how do you compare China's rise with US rise in historical perspective? And how do you see the future? Is there a possibility for Chinese replacing the US?
There's one more question, shall we
Yes,
take it? Yeah.
yes, of course.
Please.
Yes, please. Yes,
No, the gentleman behind you was the person.
yes. Please introduce yourself, sir.
We'll have another round.
Combe Carpentier, World Affairs Journal. With regard to the US-China conundrum, it seems that the US is now bent on a policy of somehow forcing China to cut back on almost everything through sanctions and tariffs. Yet the deficit in US-China trade is still increasing to the detriment of the US. So what do you expect the US will do next? Because I think they are coming to a point where they feel that if they want to remain number one, they somehow have to bring China down quite a few pegs. And obviously China will resist. So do you see any change of that relationship through a rebalancing of the import-export situation? That seems, however, not possible anymore.
So these 3 questions, and then Kalyani's question remains unanswered. What does India lack?
Millions out of poverty. We have massive healthcare programs. We do have a very successful interventions across many sectors. So we're doing very well, I would say. So, ma'am, I'll take up the 3 questions that have been posed. Firstly, African investments. I think the African countries really are very happy. They were very starved for resources, particularly capital investments. And across the research that I did, you can take a copy of my paper with 60 odd references, and you'd find that the African economies have welcomed Chinese investments which come with very limited conditionality. You look at Japanese investments, or you look at many other, the World Bank investments, for example, or even the IMF's loans, they come with ruthless conditionality. In fact, the Bretton Woods institutions are famous for being ruthless conditionality setters. So suddenly you have this country which is willing to let your own contractors take up jobs. You look at the AIIB financing modules, and you'll find that the AIIB is willing to lend even to local contractors. Unlike the ADB, which would insist on Japanese contractors to come and take up projects. Also, in terms of the gestation periods, there are certain changes. So it is good money. However, as you've seen, Pakistan has had some concerns with regard to their debt sustainability with this kind of exposure. It may be cheap money coming in now, but on a long term, whether it would be sustainable, there are concerns. However, African countries, they have benefited massively from the HIPC debt waiver when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister of UK. They got all debts written off a decade back. So perhaps they may look at another debt waiver if that were to happen.
The question of democracy, it has gone to rogue states as well.
Yes.
How do
Well, you see, in terms of the Bretton Woods institutions lending, they had to be certain benchmarks. And the United States leading the world based on the Wilsonian principles of democracy and meritocracy has been one of the great changes after the World War II. The Chinese lending doesn't come like that. The Chinese lending, they are willing to lend to countries like Mauritania, countries like Somalia. They are willing to even lend to rogue states, and it comes with little conditionality. That is the difference. So a Chinese-led international order is quite different from an American-led international order. So it is important that the American-led order survives in a long term. And the Bretton Woods institutions have undergone significant changes, but they have brought in massive developmental progress across the world. The second point is, which you had raised, as to how China and the United States look at each other. And I have seen, I suppose you read the Chinese International Political Weekly and Political Journal, Chinese International Political Journal. It's a monthly journal in which author after author has been saying that the United States is in a state of inexorable decline. And China would be replacing the United States over a period of time. However, that is not a statement of fact. It may appear to be a huge statement of spin. The United States, as a $14 trillion economy with a per capita income of almost $34,000, is far ahead of and as a beacon of democracy, is far ahead of where the Chinese stand today. However, several provinces of China, particularly the eastern region, be it Shanghai, Hong Kong, Dalian, these have reached advanced economy status, and it depends on how their industrial zones function in the coming years, whether China can at all move from middle income status to advanced economy status. But they're carrying a huge amount of debt, and I'm not very sure with this kind of debt how the internal banks will face. You see, we are fearing our own banks carrying so much in non-performing assets. Look at the debt they are carrying. $2,500 billion is the debt they are carrying from their banks. So if something were to go wrong and the Chinese economy were to cool down suddenly or crash, it would be well nigh impossible for anybody to bail them out. But China and the US, I think right now the US is well ahead. The dollar remains the preeminent currency of the world, and that's what I have said in my paper also, that it is going to be the reserve asset of the world. The last question that he had raised, the third question that he had raised, what will the United States do next? I think the United States should adhere to a WTO-compatible trade policy regime. It should not tinker around with the global world order that it has set. Some of the sanctions that it has imposed over a long run may not be sustainable, and they may not be effective also. A global rebalancing will happen only when the Americans start producing more and they start exporting more. But unfortunately, at this point of time, they're looking at a huge mountain of trade deficit, and it has not been coming down. It used to be $150 billion. Today, it's about $372 billion. And tariffs per se cannot reduce this imbalance. It has to be something else, and it has to be an increase in their own domestic productivity and greater innovation, I suppose. Otherwise, this kind of trade deficits are not easily overcome.
Yes, madam, you had a question.
As a supplement to Kalyani's question,
Could you identify yourself?
I'm Poonam Dabas, I'm from the media. China's growth story, as I understand, is because of the manufacturing sector. And in India, what I understand is we skipped over to the service sector. So I would like to understand if that played a role. And secondly, my question is what you said about the writing off of the debts. How would then China be impacted by all its investments in Africa if they have to write those investments? Write off.
Oh, yes, please.
Hello, sir. This is Sakshi. India's participation in that initiative. Do you think India is losing out by not participating vis-a-vis our neighbor like Pakistan? And what could be the implication? Because this One Belt, One Road initiative covers most of Southeast Asia as well as Afghanistan and Pakistan. But India has not categorically become part of this.
Whether China will write off debt or not is anybody's guess at this point of time. They have lent, and repayments will commence. And the Bretton Woods institutions had to write off debt. That was part of the heavily indebted poor countries initiative. And that was led by Gordon Brown when he became the Prime Minister of UK. And it was a major initiative wherein which he brought the world together to write off the debt of, he wanted to write off the debt of African countries. And in the process, some other countries of South Asia also, their debts were written off. However, it's not going to be easy for the African countries with debt sustainability well below, in terms of when you look at tax GDP ratios, in terms of debt to GDP ratios. It's not easy for African countries to repay these loans, and we'll have to wait and see how China would respond to a debt default. So far, we've not heard of a major debt default on Chinese loans. We'll have to wait and see, and as to how the Chinese authorities respond to this.
I could just come in very quickly on that. Yeah, please.
My question is, how would it impact China in case that situation arises?
If I might just respond to what your supplementary, and I think China has displayed a willingness, and it relates also to your question about them being willing to lend to rogue states. It is their willingness to convert debt into equity. So if there is a debt failure, their default, they're quite willing to say, okay, we'll give us land and we will have an equity stake in the development of your country. And this is, V.Srinivas, I'd like your response on this. This is a markedly different model from what the US and the multilateral institutions had initially,
Yes.
when debt was debt. And if there was default, there was no conversion into equity.
No.
So this is what, to me, marks the imperial ambitions of China. I mean, they want to own land in different parts of the world, and they're quite happy to do so. And so it's a very different model altogether. But what I'd like your reactions to that.
Yes. I was just looking at China's net international investment positions, and it is massive in terms of how they're investing abroad. The pace at which they were investing, 20.7% of their GDP they were investing into outside. So a country that is putting in so much money is bound to have an international ambition.
Right.
And a default, the biggest default I have heard was when the Argentinian government defaulted on IMF debt. And I do remember going to Washington, D.C. in 2002, when Argentina had virtually reduced to barter, wherein which you had to give shoes to get rice. It was that kind. The Argentine currency had collapsed. However, at that point of time, the lenders were willing to take a haircut and help restore the Argentine currency. A US-led economic order handled debt, as what the chairperson has pointed out, that this was exactly like a debt was never converted into equity.
Right.
However, the Chinese lending model, they are converting it to equity, and they would be looking at massive land areas. For example, in Mozambique, they are looking at aluminium plants being corporate assets of their public sector plants being transferred to Chinese companies. For example, the Chinese Petroleum Corporation getting into Nigeria with huge shares. Also into Uganda, where massive oil investments of Chinese petroleum corporations are being seen. So perhaps the new age imperialism is quite different from what we had in an international order earlier. And soon we may hear the Chinese Petroleum Corporation being bigger than ExxonMobil or any of the British Petroleum or any of the other companies. There's one more point, sir. Let me just respond on OBOR.
She had a question on manufacturing and services.
Yes, I will respond to that. OBOR is a fascinating initiative, and when you look at the sheer breadth of Xi Jinping's vision, you'll also find that it was a compulsion for them that they had to change from exports towards capital investments. So they came up with the One Belt, One Road initiative, and it generated employment across the countries which were borrowing. It also fulfilled their massive infrastructural gaps that they were there. Whether we are a member of the Asia Infrastructure Bank, we are the second largest shareholder on the AIIB, and in case countries are borrowing for the OBOR projects from AIIB, India would be financing it. But it is largely a Chinese-led investment model wherein which bilateral loans are happening. And there, of course, we have no role. It would be through the AIIB. But the AIIB has no membership from two of the biggest democracies in the world. The United States is not a member, and Japanese are not a member. Further, when you read the statements coming out from the Japanese leadership, Shinzo Abe has been very critical of AIIB lending, very, very critical. In fact, he says that bad money is going to bad economies, and they have refused to join the AIIB. The United States is not a member either. So we are there, and it is a conscious decision that India will contribute to multilateral development. And as far as our positions on the Bretton Woods institutions go, India has always held that we would encourage investments into Pakistan or into developmental projects into Pakistan or into any of the South Asian countries or anywhere else. And if you remember Prime Minister Vajpayee's famous letter to General Musharraf, it says that poverty is a common enemy. And many times I remember that our representatives in the World Bank voting for developmental projects in Pakistan. The last one is manufacturing.
And services. She said we leapt over manufacturing and we went.
Yes. The Indian growth story is quite different from what any other growth story is, and a large part of our growth is services-based exports, and particularly software services, engineering goods, and the growth model is quite different compared to the Chinese growth model driven by public sector enterprises. And public sector enterprises getting massive loans from public sector banks. And that is what necessitated their massive recapitalization. And that is the fear that they have so much internal debt that they're carrying, that the manufacturing boom, if it were to slow down, or the American tariffs start hitting them hard, then how would they respond to job losses? And if you see the Chinese unemployment rates have been consistent around 5%. So they're allowing rural to urban migration. For example, this was not there earlier. People in rural areas had to stay in rural areas. Today they're allowing people to come from rural areas to urban areas. They're also trying to deepen their social welfare measures. For example, health cover is being protected. Income tax rates are being brought down. They are making efforts to try and help if there were a crisis of significant nature. Yes.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
It's not a question, it was an added thing to the investment in Africa. They have allowed, though, the Africans to head the organizations that they have built, but at the lower levels, they have exported a huge number of Chinese population.
Yes.
So, as you said, the employment rate increasing in China, actually a surplus is going to these African states.
Yes.
So, I don't know what's that implication and how will it unfold.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, they're coming to India also, as Kalyani said. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Would you like to? Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that?
No, I actually am not familiar with the subject. So, on terms of their visa policies, whether they're entering into Indian companies,
No,
and I'm not familiar with this.
A lot of people going out of China to work in Africa. There's a huge population which will also settle there. If they stay there for long durations, they will settle there. And if the equity that the debt gets converted
Yes, of course,
the
of
land
course.
is theirs, they can
Yes.
very well
Yes, of
stay
course.
there.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. That's a statement of fact. There is no dispute on that.
Any other questions? One question that I have, there are constant India-China comparisons being made all the time. But what we don't look at is the skill development that they had done prior to 1978. Yes, today is the 40th anniversary of that, but they had built up a base, a skills base, on the basis of which they were able to take off. So there is a fundamental difference between the two countries in terms of the importance they gave to skill development even before they opened up, and the lack of importance in India to skill development even
Yes.
today.
Yes.
Probably that also relates to education.
Hema is
Yes,
very
of course. It's basic. Its literacy was very, very advanced there. Yeah, that's right.
And what is remarkable is that the way
Yes, please. Please introduce. Charu is here.
Caught up with the lack in the language, the English expertise which India had, which gave us the competitive edge, was very soon overcome by them in last few years, which is again very remarkable.
Yes, I do.
I think the basic difference which I find between a Chinese and other countries, even if you stay Indian, Chinese are very hardworking. Wherever Chinese workers have come in India to work,
We are also very hardworking, extremely hardworking.
the output of a Chinese mason is 3 times that of an Indian. Their modus operandi is entirely different. For example, if a mason has to work from this point to that point tomorrow, he will bring all his tools, keep it there for tomorrow. And the moment he comes, say at 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock or whatever is the time, right from that time he will start working. And all the equipments and material is available at that point.
That's interesting. Do you have personal experience of this?
Yes, I have a personal.
Could you tell us a little bit about where you saw this?
In steel plants like Bhushan Steel and all that, lot of Chinese workers came.
It's very interesting.
Yes, I'll respond on that, sir. See, there was one thing I must share. In terms of when I saw the factories in Dalian, and the first question I asked was, how many shirts does a lady stitch? And they said 30 shirts in a day. You go to Tirupur and you ask how many shirts does a lady stitch, an apparel worker stitch, and it was about 12 to 15 shirts. So in terms of skill base, it's not in terms of number of hours. We work the same number of hours. In terms of skill base, definitely there are gaps, and the skill based shortages should be addressed.
No, skill is one thing. Another is your
Also the machinery, you see,
now,
the
this
technology.
may be the difference because of the type of government. There, a person does not have a freedom of speech. Here we only speak, we hardly work.
No, sir. I'll also add on
I'll
that.
give you a very classic example. I went to China when I was traveling by a tourist bus. There was a beautiful building and single story. So I thought this must, I had a lot of security guards. So I asked the lady guide, what is this building? Is it your president's house or something like that? She replied very nicely. She told that I really do not know where our president lives. I have never personally seen him. And we are not supposed to know
where he lives and all that. So I really do not know what is his building. So that type of
Somebody has
confinement,
it.
they
Yeah.
are living.
Yeah.
Their only aim is, in the morning the worker comes, starts working, evening he goes back, maybe he goes to some cinema or somewhere to shop.
Thank
But the basic philosophies are different.
Yeah. There are some pending
yes,
questions.
Yes, not a question, but I'm now bubbling with a little bit of annoyance. China is totally 1984. Uncle Tom, his big brother, is watching. Their existing social credit system is something India would never like to imbue. And please, let's face it, their productivity has nothing to do with their skill set. It's more to do with the impositions. So let's not compare both the countries. Let's stick to the topic of what was our discussion today.
Yes, sir, you had a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to bring you back, if you don't mind, to the issue of currency. As you know, there has been literature in China coming from high-placed bureaucrats about how the US has essentially controlled the world economy through what is called the extravagant or privilege of the dollar, which is essentially a fiat currency that the US can print at will. And the Chinese were obviously pointing to the fact that if you wanted to become number one, China wanted to become number one, they had to somehow overthrow the dollar hegemony.
Excuse me, we can't hear him. Yeah.
They had to overthrow the dollar hegemony. And that's what they seem to be in the process of doing, and probably by recycling the dollars they are earning into investments, into hard assets. So do you see that happening? Because when you said, they are willing to exchange debt for equity, let's not forget that the US have done it in a different way. If you read the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you can see how they have used debt to literally enslave many countries. So I'm not sure the difference is so great.
Would you like to respond to that?
It's an observation. I thought there's no question.
Would you like to react to it?
No, nothing at all.
Yeah.
We take note of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. I've been waiting actually.
Yes.
The discussion should come to this point. So I prefer speaking in Hindi if you don't mind. बहुत समय से देख रहे थे चाइना राइज का क्वेश्चन है हाउ चाइना रोज हाउ दे केम अप टू दिस पॉइंट किस कारण से मैं उस कारण की बात कर रहा हूँ आप देखा हमारे पास सब कुछ हमारे पास एक्सपर्ट्स हैं इकोनॉमिस्ट हैं एवरीथिंग वी हैव और पीपल आर हार्ड वर्किंग ऑफ कोर्स बहुत पीपल आर हार्ड वर्किंग आई डोंट डिनाई दैट मैं एक सिंगल फैक्टर के ऊपर आता हूँ जिस कारण से मे बी आई एम राइट और रॉन्ग आई डोंट नो बट आई वुड लाइक टू स्टेट दैट कि सिंगल फैक्टर जो मेरी ऑब्जर्वेशन में आया है जिस कारण से चाइना यहाँ पर पहुंचा है वो कारण जर्मनी में भी कभी था वो कारण जापान में भी था सिंगल फैक्टर वो कारण हम कोरिया में भी ढूंढ रहे हैं वो कारण हमारे यहाँ नहीं है उस कारण पर मैं सिर्फ उस कारण पर बोलना चाहता हूँ दैट सिंगल फैक्टर टू मी इज द डिसिप्लिन्ड मैन पावर दे आर हार्ड वर्किंग टू वी हैव एवरीथिंग यू जस्ट लुक deep into it what you find there is no discipline कहीं भी खड़े हो जो कुछ भी कर लो किसी को भी उठा के ले जाओ कहीं भी पेशाब कर लो कुछ भी कर लो कोई किसी की बात नहीं सुनता there is no law there is a law but there is no order there is a law there is no order there is a law and there is the order that is the difference
It's a different model.
Any questions pending questions that have not been asked?
I want to make one point. When the Chinese labor comes to India, I have heard, I have not seen, in Gujarat and other states, they bring them and they house them in the tents, and then, they are captive labor. So they cannot go anywhere they like. So they are not disciplined because
They are captive, or the public, or the same company. I'm not familiar. I have not seen actually. I have not seen this matter actually. Not seen.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we can bring this session to a conclusion. Let us express our thanks to the speaker for having given us a great deal of very illuminating material to think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Pleasure.
Great pleasure.